Welcome everybody again to our roundtable number 3, Immobility in Times of COVID-19. It's sponsored by the IUAES Commission on Migration, and you can see the name of the 4 of us who are the organizers from the Commission on Migration. Later, when I'm not so busy anymore, I will also post our link for our commission meeting, which will take place tomorrow. I better don't say any time because I'm also mixed up with the different times we are told here, but I will just write it into the chat. So we will be very happy if everybody would have time to join our commission meeting to plan some activities ahead. What you already started right now. Yeah, I will not say anything anymore because we are already short of time. You see, we should actually have 6 speakers. We told every speaker that they could speak 10 minutes about their ongoing research projects, which have all something to do with the topic of this roundtable. And you have 5 minutes for Q&A after each short paper. And then hopefully we have some time also for general discussion at the end. We have 2 hours altogether, so that should be hopefully enough. We will start with Professor Biao Xiang from the University of Oxford. Thank you for joining us, and he will present very shortly his current research under the title Immobilizing Capabilities. So thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot. I mean, I'm very pleased to be here. Someone is on the doorstep now. And so first of all, may I do a little commercial? First of all, I actually moved away from Oxford. Now I'm part of the Max Planck Institute of Social Anthropology. And one of the new initiatives that I'm taking in Germany is to start a mobility lab, and we have an inventory. Then all of you are very much welcomed to contribute short entries to the inventory. So we have quite lots of pieces that are related to mobility, e-mobility, and the COVID. So I will put the link in the chat room later. But now I just wanted to outline a couple of quick ideas to see what you think. One idea is that we witnessed in the COVID that if you want to lock down population on larger scale, you have to do 2 things. One is that you have to redistribute the mobility. You can't have a situation that everyone stay home. If someone stay home, some other people must carry out certain mobility work, like delivery workers, etc. So you need a coordinated redistribution of mobility. Number 2 is that you have to securitize mobility, meaning that you have to intervene instead of stop everyone's mobility. You have to intervene to minimize the threat, perceived threat. I mean, in COVID time, of course, is a health threat of the mobility through measures like, contact and the tracing app, and also all kinds of equipments, make sure that the workers will carry certain equipments and they follow rules during their movement. So that's what I mean by immobilizing capabilities. Whether or not a society has a capability to stop mobility of many people and to reshape mobility. That probably is a key indicator of resilience in coming decades. As I think it's a question with direct policy relevance. So how do we develop these capabilities? So now I'm thinking of to explore what kind of infrastructure needed to be put in place in order to develop such capabilities. I mean, based on mainly observation in China, but with comparison to India, I think we observe three things are important. The digital app is one, and then certain residential community structure is quite important. You need the people to have all full information of the residents, and also you need, frankly, you need the people to deliver food to your doorstep and collect the temperature on a daily basis. And thirdly, you need certain type of intermediaries come in to do all kinds of works. And in the Chinese case, this is something I still haven't figured out empirically. I think what they have done is that they turn lots of commercial intermediaries into agencies of social control. One example is about rental houses. So migrant workers, the Chinese government is quite keen to have migrant workers to start moving from actually February last year. And then you have the question of quarantine. How are you going to make sure that the workers will quarantine and where to quarantine, how you rent places for the purpose of quarantine. And actually landlords and the real estate agencies are given the task of social control. So you have to make sure people quarantine, and some people will check actually in the end. The migrant workers have to be given a certificate to say that they have fulfilled the 14 days quarantine requirement. So, I mean, there is some obvious reason why the commercial intermediaries will carry out such social control functions, but then the detailed information is still to be collected. So that is kind of the e-mobility infrastructure, which is tied to mobility infrastructure, the three things: digital app, certain residential. I mean, this is what lacking in India. The huge tragic consequences resulted from the sudden lockdown in March 2020 is a lack of such infrastructure that enable the government to stop and redistribute the mobility. So then this leads to a new type of power for the state, what I call the logistical power. We know Michael Mann has a famous concept, infrastructural power. Infrastructural power basically is a power that you govern the society through society rather than above or over society, right? A good example is the road, and also how our income tax is collected. I mean, you don't need, in like UK or Germany, the income tax is collected before you receive the money and without your knowledge. So they have this kind of infrastructure for the state to implement its will. But logistical is a little different. Logistical power means that the state can be very nimbly ask you to move or stop moving, right? It is a dominance of the state over society through its capacity of coordinating mobilities and coordinating connections between private actors without intervening as a private actor's actual business. So logistical power, yeah, I mean, a good example is all the railway systems and the control over the airline systems. And now, of course, all the apps and etc. So again, China is a good example. So them are still now thinking through the concept of logistical power and how that is achieved. It is, I mean, the three ways Chinese government achieved that. Number one, it is still rely on laws. So the juridical power, the traditional, the power is still important. Number two is through delegating power to intermediaries related to what I said. The third one is informationalization. The massively informationalize social activities, turn social activities into data, then you control that. And that I think is interesting because it's no longer about substantive social relations. It's all about the data management. So the social relations is turning into data. This is what the informationalization means. So then you create new type of relation between individual and the state. So in a way, it's a depoliticization. Logistic power is very much about depoliticization. You are not talking about substantive relations, responsibilities, or duties, and everything is managed as data through apps. So that is a logistical power. Anyway, so that I think probably is something for me is kind of emerging trend that we observe during COVID. So yeah, I mean, if you have any comments, how can develop the three things, the immobilizing capability, basically capability of immobilizing. Number two is immobility infrastructure. It's a system that facilitate, stop, redistribute, and reshape mobilities. And finally, the concept of logistical power is a state of power that dominates society through its capability of coordinating mobility and the connections between private actors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting input, I think. So I guess there are many questions and comments. Who would like to start? Leonardo?
If no one else, if somebody wants to talk first, I can wait. No? I mean, I just wanted to take a bit more of Biao. I thought very interesting what you were presented. I was just curious about, because when you're saying, like, I'm a person who likes Foucault a lot, okay? And so immediately when you said what you said about logistic power, I thought about biopower. I thought about also necropolitics. So can you perhaps relate to those concepts if they're not too foreign to you, and to what extent what you're saying with logistic power, it's like, let's say, is the power over people's movement, as Foucault would say, is the power of people's lives, or, you know, as in, can you relate to that in a way or another? Because this is also power over life in a certain way, but power over a specific dimension of people's lives, right? You know what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, so I think logistical power is not defined by the subject of power. So biopower is defined by the subject of power primarily. As you said, it's a power over life. Logistical power is a method of power, is to say this is a power achieved through coordination of mobility. So logistic power is not a power over people's movement or mobility. Actually, logistic power is a power over everything, but it's achieved through the particular method of regulating a movement. But it's not interested in movement per se. It can be extended to other domains. I think the biggest difference between logistical power and the biopower is probably logistic power is much closer to Deleuze than to Foucault. Foucault, the biopower, disciplinary, and etc., is always has this notion of creating certain subjects, right? You change people's mind, and you create a subjectivity, your understanding, and etc. But the logistical power is that really leave you alone. So it's more about the Deleuze idea of this control, without touching your soul. Is more about to create a condition that will lead you to move in a particular way without creating a particular subjectivity. I mean, of course, in broader sense, you still need certain subjects, and people need to use app, and people need to have this technological know-how, to use a more smartphone and etc. But there's the emphasis here is that the subject it become less important. And its a method become more important. So institutions become less important, but the operational processes become quite important. You can say, apparatus in the sense of device that type of apparatus become important. But apparatus, like in the sense of institutions, school or hospital, less important. But the smartphone or the apps become more important. Yeah. So that's a bit of a, I mean, it's really emerging. I mean, I'm not sure at all, you know, to what extent is important, but it's interesting to observe how now the community, residential community is being governed. Actually, I found out it's very little, there's kind of a control about the people's thought. I mean, there is a censorship in China, of course, there's a certain that kind of thing there. But in community, I found it's really everything is being informationalized. It's all about, so the data, and does not really touch who you are, but it's all about what you do exactly. Yeah.
May I just try to redirect a little bit, Sophia? Can I, Sophia and Vinicius and Kristín? Yeah, anyway, so it's more or less what you're saying is that with COVID and all the kinds of regulations that is going on, is that sort of say technology itself is sort of taking over. Technology meaning the technology that we humans developed in order to coordinate things sort of takes precedence over people's own and institutional own interest and procedures. Is that more or less what you're trying to say? It's sort of like a cyborg that is not designed to be such, but it takes an existence that is controlling our lives more so than we intended. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yes, yeah. But the question is that what type of technology, right? Because I mean, again, you know, Foucault would say it's all the previous, all these medical science is also about the technology. So the
I thought about bureaucracy. Bureaucracy as technology. That's what I had in my mind, actually. You know what I'm saying? All these restrictions and directions on how to act that are not coming from a moral level, but it's more from a technocratic level. Yeah.
So there's a probably even more than that is that I'm really thinking of the operation, the notion of operation. Right. So it's a no blueprint, you know, it's not really institutionalized, but it's all about tasks and something works or not. They don't ask it's right or not. It's all about the work. So at that very moment, so this kind of everything is operationalized. That you are right. It's very much this type of operational technology, became very important. But of course, I mean, in the end of the day, it's immediately new type of older style power relation emerges. That's through ethnography studies, and I discovered actually intermediaries, all these commercial intermediaries now become more powerful because now they have the function of, you know, being a agency of social control. So people very quickly try to get power under themselves. Right. So so that so we have to go back to institutional and structural analysis as well. But just as a way how things happen. So the idea of infrastructure and logistic power is to really talk about method, to talk about dynamics, rather than say, well, there's a new type of power, logistic power that is standing alone. I doubt that will be the case. It must be mingled with other type of power, you know, despotic power and infrastructure power. But here it's just to say that, probably there's new dynamics that makes things in this way.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we should, we should postpone the other questions we have probably for the end, for the general discussion, and go on with our second speaker for today, Dr. Amrita Datta, who's currently Marie Curie Fellow at the Department of Sociology at the University of Siegen in Germany. And her working title for the short presentation is Mobility as Survival and Freedom, Sociology of Immobility and its Implications for Women and Queer Migrants. The floor is yours. Welcome very much. You're muted still.
Yeah, I'll unmute. Yeah. Am I audible now? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this really interesting and round table. And of course, like immobility and COVID, this is something I have grown interest in the last 1 year. So my project at the University of Siegen is on the Indian immigrants in Germany and their, the entire dynamic of transnational migration and mobility. And this is a paper which I finished writing recently, and I will just try to, like share some portions from the paper. I mean, of course, 10 minutes is not enough time to say everything, but perhaps, I will just give the crux, and then, in the discussion time, we can talk more and discuss. Of course, when COVID broke, most of the governments and almost all the governments in the world, they imposed global lockdown, because of which the pandemic arrived for different kinds of people in a very different manner. Why I say so? Because mobility restriction, that is immobility, as Biao also talked about, it meant very different things to different people, because for some people it came as a boon that you could work from home. For some it was a bane. For some people it was a double jeopardy, because they have already lived their lives in certain restricted manner, and so the pandemic just meant that it is just exacerbated their immobilizing factors. So in this paper, I'm interested in those for whom mobility restriction was already a social reality in their everyday experiences, even before the pandemic. Not because they lack physical capacity to move, but because they live in socially crippling circumstances. So for several women and queer people across the world, restricted mobility is a social norm. It has collective sanction and cultural approval, because patriarchy in general as a structure of domination is built around the understanding that women's place is at home and the so-called private sphere. So although women at large have regularly been contesting this structure, but the bifurcation between the public and the private, I'm afraid, is really well defined in several societies. And this division between the home and the world, as Rabindranath Tagore called it in his famous novel with the same title, it acts like an invisible border. And some people, they are just forbidden to cross over this border. So since this already offers the normative structure in several societies, especially in societies in the global south, including South Asian countries like India, because that's where my focus is, the coronavirus pandemic brought forth the double impact of demarcation, one for the sake of gendered performances and another for the sake of health safety. Now, therefore, echoing Ailet Shaka's position, I have just started engaging with her work. Of course, I don't know everything that she says, but I just started reading her latest book, The Shifting Borders, where she says that border is not a fixed category, but its meanings and impositions keep changing in relation to different contexts. So in this paper, I will focus on women and I'm focusing already on women and queer migrants, in India and from India to Germany, and discuss how immobility imposed due to the pandemic, meant further imposition on their already restricted lives. So I will not really get into the detail, but how mobility restriction has already been a tradition passed on through moral policing in several countries in the world, in some African countries, also in South Asian countries, and women and girls are not allowed to go out. They are regularly monitored, their mobility is supervised, and they cannot go out in certain parts of the day, especially during dark hours, wee hours of the morning, in the fear that they might get raped and molested. So loitering is essentially not allowed. And in this connection, very interesting work has been done by Shilpa Farke and two other colleagues of hers. They have done this work on women in Mumbai and their access to public transport and public spaces in terms of mobility contestation. So they have used the term loitering in their work, and I find the term really, really interesting in this context. I'll come back to this term a little later. So mobility restriction in this entire context lays down a chicken and egg situation, where women are prohibited from free mobility in public spaces because these spaces are unsafe. And these spaces are unsafe because you hardly find women in there. So this is like a chicken and egg situation in some of the societies. And along with the women, it also, mobility restriction also poses similar challenges to several non-male actors, especially, for example, the queer people. So like considering India in point, India is still, it hasn't decriminalized homosexuality. So therefore, it is often dangerous for, practicing homosexuals to be out at large, to engage into sartorial expressions that demonstrate their gender fluidity or preferences, or to just roam around freely and loiter in public spaces. So consequently, women and queer people are often found to be walking or traveling in groups from one place to another. And this also serves two purposes. First, that the collectivity ensures certain amount of safety on the roads. And secondly, their peers, their friends are often approved of by their families, so who view this solidarity as a mutual check. Now, coming to the pandemic era, because I hardly think COVID-19 is going to go away. It is not just a one small phase in history. It is actually, we have entered a COVID era. This is my personal understanding, but that's for another discussion. So when it began with the global lockdown, that it meant that, women and queer people who are already disallowed by their families to move freely are now prohibited by the government also to step out. So coupled with the filial restriction, now they face the state embargo, both joining hands to impose immobility. Now, such immobility has already triggered domestic violence, denial of access to education, emotional loss due to weakening of solidarity, among women and queer people with their peers. And since freedom of mobility is integral to mobility, freedom of expression, among other things, several women and queer people, they have already demonstrated helplessness and diminishing survival chances because of the pandemic. So in relation to this, I will quickly explore two cases which stem from my study. And both these participants are a part of my larger project on the Indian immigrant communities in Germany. Now, the first case is of a young woman from India who arrived in Germany just after the global lockdown was eased. And she was, because of the bio bubble, she could travel. So I'm calling her Ira for the sake of anonymity. I will of course not, use the real names and credentials. So let's call her Ira. And the second case is that of a gay young man from India, again, pursuing his doctoral program in Germany, who managed to come back to Germany from his visit to his hometown in Calcutta just before the pandemic hit the world. And I'm calling him Kabir. So I first started talking to Ira when, she was still in India, and she had already got admission in a German university, and she was, waiting for the lockdown to ease and she could travel. So our initial interactions were very brief. She would not talk for long. The explanation she gave is there are many people staying in one apartment, her entire family. So, she couldn't really talk for long and very intimately. But when I met her in Germany, in person, finally, when I met her in Germany, she was really engaging and, really interactive. So I asked her, why weren't you at least interactive enough when you were in India? So she, and I quote here, I would mostly be depressed. My parents never wanted me to come to Germany at all alone. They're conservative people. They would hardly allow me to stay the night at a friend's place. Forget about moving to another country. And she goes on to say, for the sake of time management, I'm not, giving the entire quote, that how she felt suffocated at home, and it was only her best friend's place, which is in the neighborhood. That's where she could, before COVID, that's where she could go for, it was more like a refuge for her to go there and to spend time, because her parents wouldn't really let her go out and wouldn't really want her to study so much. So she applied in German universities without telling her parents. And when they came to know, of course, she was supposed to leave for Germany, but she couldn't because of the pandemic. So she had to stay with them. So it was like a really difficult situation, because she could neither go out, she could neither go to her best friend's house. She just had to stay there and, just negotiate with that entire family drama, as she puts it. So of all the conversations that I have had with her in the course of my interviews, this particular, conversation stood out insofar as I wanted to understand the social implications of supervised mobility or relative immobility. And it also clearly demonstrates that, as a woman in India, her experience when it came to mobility and free movements remained essentially conditional, bounded by a patriarchal bargain where the border could at best be extended till her best friend's house in the neighborhood. So it is also interesting to observe that she looked forward to the immigration process in the hope that migration would liberate her. It is safe, therefore, perhaps to conclude that migration actually helped her access some of her freedom, despite the pandemic even going on in Germany, because now she could dismiss the household border and its social demarcations. So this is one case. And the second case is the gay man that I met in Germany. I met him when he had just come back from his little visit to his hometown. He just managed to enter Germany before the entire lockdown. So as a conversation starter, he himself starts that, and I'm just quoting him, that I'm so glad I could manage to come back to Berlin before the global lockdown. So of course, my question was why? What would be so wrong if you stayed with your family, in your hometown during a pandemic? And again, I'm quoting him that, well, for starters, I would not perhaps be even alive. And then he says that my family, although they know I'm gay, they refuse to acknowledge the fact. They are visibly embarrassed by me, and they are relieved that I do not stay with them. That's why, so they do not have to explain about me in family functions. So when I'm in Calcutta, I cannot really walk around in the neighborhood. They would not encourage me to do that. They say people will gossip about me. So, and then he goes on to say that how it is so different for him in Berlin. He can just wear whatever he wants. He can go out anytime he wants. It's liberating. And at least that, so he says that, so although all these came to a halt because of the limited mobility due to the pandemic, I could nevertheless breathe in peace at my own room in my Wege. Imagine not being able to go out and not being able to stay at home either. I have lived in India during my teenage and already faced strict mobility restrictions. I know how it is to have embargo all the time. So from this conversation, of course, we went on to discuss about how to what extent queer people are often locked inside their houses by their own families just to avoid public scrutiny. And he also communicated that he was subject to sexual violence on the streets, in his late teens, after which his parents would often stop him from late night outing with friends and alike. So all these are before the pandemic. They have nothing to do with the pandemic per se. Now, taking both these people's cases in consideration, what to me emerges is that although forced mobility induced by the pandemic appeared to be the new normal for some, for several other people, mobility restrictions were normalized much before COVID-19. And inability to exercise free mobility is not a pandemic-specific situation. It pre-existed COVID, but undoubtedly exacerbated during the pandemic. Such shadow pandemics infest our social lives at large, and therefore it is imperative we do not isolate this phenomena as singular instances, but universalize these problems. And also, interestingly enough, both Ira and Kabir have somewhere welcomed their immigrant status and explored immigration as an escape mechanism to end the mobility restriction already faced at home. Now, why I find Shakhar's work interesting and relevant is for two reasons. Echoing Shakhar, I would maintain that immigrants in context and the people similar to them are already subject to border control even before they receive the immigrant status, thereby subject to multiple restrictions and denial of rights that a cartographic restriction could only accentuate. And secondly, I further argue that health-induced mobility restriction imposed by the state is that extraterritorial entity that Shakhar talks about, which reinforces border control for women and queer people in conservative societies who are already living under forced immobility enforced by their families who demarcate their mobility threshold and keep redrawing them arbitrarily. Therefore, by the time these people are facing mobility and physical mobility as restraints, they already have experienced mobility control twice at home because of their gender and again because of the pandemic. So from that standpoint, borders are not just shifting, they multiply. And borders are not just physical demarcations, they are embodiment of humans as agents of legal and moral authority. So therefore, as much as the police and the border control officials control the displaced people and refugees loitering around the barbed wire, in some societies, families impersonate that moral police and organize similar control mechanisms. And last point I will quickly make, coming back to the term loitering, that I find loitering is a very appropriate word here to compare immobility and vulnerability of women and queer people. So on one, the term loitering is firstly in direct opposition to term immobility, while on one hand it means hovering around freely without purpose and exercise that invite immediate control of moral authorities in some societies. And it also epitomizes the uncertainties experienced by individual and communities, always subject to external supervision and judgment. So this is, I would stop now. I think my time is up. And yeah, so this is what I would like to say, and we can talk more during the question session.
Thank you very much, Amrita. I'm sure there are many questions, but I think we should keep it to a very short one, probably. If somebody has a very short question, we could have time now. Otherwise, if I don't see a question now, probably it's better to keep them to the general discussion later. Yeah, I think we should do that, because otherwise we are running out of time. And I think there are so many parallels between your papers, so I think it's very interesting to have the general discussion for the papers together. Thank you again. So I think we should continue with the next speaker. Our third speaker of today is Dr. Leonardo from the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. And his working title is Forced Mobility Between Geographic Mobility and the Experience of Immobility. So thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm afraid that what I have today is only an insight. And I was explaining here today a little bit before. I was involved in several things that took a lot of my time. And I hope that what I have to say is something interesting. So basically, the idea is that COVID-19 or the crisis, so-called COVID-19 crisis, precipitated a type of human immobility that became sort of hegemonic in the common sense imagination in much of people's experiences. It's that the one that is characterized by both geographic and experiential immobility. And it's often claimed to affect everyone democratically, right? So you have things like, for example, Madonna claiming that, oh, you see, COVID-19 is just democratized society because everybody suffers the same. Everybody is affected in the same way, where of course we can discuss that. Of course, that's not true from the point of view of most anthropological studies, but that's the common sense understanding of the thing, right? So that we are all affected at the level of humankind. So, and I like to contrapose this to the type of immobility that is rare and analyzed as such, and it's when subjects are sometimes extremely mobile geographically and yet extremely immobile in terms of the experiences. And this discussion has, of course, some history in the discussion, for example, on forced immobility within forced migration studies, and on the sedentarian bias in anthropology, as, for example, Don Chatty brought to discussion decades ago, and which entails, for example, the discussion of methodological nationalism and so on. But I'm taking this to a sort of, I think, a specific debate, which is the idea of talking about the experience of immobility, even when people are very much mobile, geographically speaking. And I'm going to contrapose a little bit the idea of diaspora and exile. So my proposal is to briefly problematize the situation of Palestinians living in 4 fieldwork sites of mine, Lebanon, Brazil, Denmark, and Austria, and conclude with a conceptual remark on immobility that I hope that would be useful to the debate intended with this roundtable. Okay, so and I also just came back from field work in Lebanon, so I would have lots to say about that in the Q&A session, about immobility and COVID-19 in a context where COVID sounds like the least of people's worries, if you're interested. And we can even apply that sort of discussion of what I'm talking about now in more conceptual ways to the experiences that people can be going through right now in Lebanon and in other places. And so today, Lebanon harbors, for example, to start with Lebanon, it harbors the most vulnerable Palestinian population in the world, with about half of them still living in refugee camps and constituting one of the oldest ongoing and most protracted refugee situations worldwide. An overwhelming majority of the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are stateless and do not have access to basic human rights, including to freedom of movement. Right, so they can only leave Lebanon upon Lebanese authorization, which is decided ad hoc on a case-by-case basis, and it's difficult to obtain and very risky because there are many cases in which those who left Lebanon are not being allowed to come back. So despite the situation, many of the Palestinians registered in Al-Jalil, one of the camps in which I conducted fieldwork in Lebanon, had already managed to emigrate to Scandinavia in the 1980s. And most of those coming out of this camp settled in Aarhus, Denmark. And for this reason, Al-Jalil is known as the Danish camp, or Al-Mukhayyam Denmark in Arabic. So despite what the Danish government had imagined when conceding them immigrant status and subsequent citizenship, and despite what many Palestinian refugees imagine, even inside Al-Jalil, many of the Palestinians in Denmark do not feel content and satisfied to live in that country. So the majority of them live in Gellerup-Parken, known as in Aarhus as a ghetto, along with Kurds from Iraq and Syria, Somalis, Syrian, Iraqis, and other Muslims. And during my field work there, Islam predominated among the youth in vernacular expressions of belonging, much more so than among most other Palestinian dominating settings that I knew. So while expressions of Palestinians are still abounded, especially among the first generation of Palestinian migrants in Gellerup-Parken, they were less prevalent among the youth, frequently appearing among the latter group as a further indexation of their Muslim identity. And so this was significantly due to the fact that the Danish context tended to stereotype Muslims, belittling national and ethnic categories of belonging. And in homogenizing Muslims, the Danish context pushed the imposition of Islam as the main category of identification for Palestinians and other minorities. And in this way, local centers of sociability became more associated with religion and economic activities than with culture and nationhood, favoring the identification of a second generation of immigrants with transnational Islamic movements. This fits the description of what Olivier Roy calls the secularization through religion. And inspired by Bruno Latour, I suggest that this is an important impulse echoing the encounter of Islam with the project of European modernity. But the main point here is that Palestinians and other minorities are not at ease with their identities in this context, as they have to deal with a very real symbolic border between them and the surrounding Danish environment. So in Austria, Palestinians first arrived in the 1970s as students, not as refugees, and then established themselves as liberal professionals such as doctors, dentists, and lawyers, engaging with local civil society politically, socially, and culturally through the political left. And historically, this relationship intensified in the years of the Chancellor Bruno Kreisky in the 1970s, who outside of the Arab world was directly responsible for the legitimation of the PLO as the only representative of the Palestinians, as opposed, for example, to the Jordanian government, as a lot of people don't know that these days anymore, that was a time when that was the thing. So while he may never actually have intended it, his acknowledgement of the PLO, as he saw this group as the only chance for dialogue with the Palestinian side, ended up legitimizing the group to the rest of the world. This in turn paved the way for the formulation of the so-called Palestinian cause as being universal, secular, and socialist to much of the European left. And after 2015, however, a large number of refugees from Afghanistan and from the Afghan and the Syrian conflicts, and in the Syrian case, bringing to Austria and especially to Vienna hundreds of Palestinians, it started to change the Austrian context. And one important consequence is a strong resistance in Austria against not only refugees, but also Arabs and Muslims, which are all commonly lumped into one stereotype again. And so this rendered the lives of Palestinians more difficult than it was in the past and has reshaped the local Austro-Palestinian sense of belonging and home. And among Palestinians in Brazil, as in Austria, religious orthodoxy did not attract much of a following, neither within a group of initially comprising 114 Palestinian refugees resettled from Iraq in 2007, nor among the established generations of Palestinians and other Arabs who had already arrived in Brazil, especially in the first half of the 20th century. So Pan-Arabism, however, appears to have seduced them more so than in Denmark or Austria. Almost all Palestinian refugees from Iraq came from the Rawashed refugee camp in Jordan, where they were sent after having been persecuted following the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003. However, many of these Palestinian refugees in Brazil emphasized to me that they were obliged to go to Brazil, since the UN wanted to close the Rawashed camp and resettle all refugees. There was a screening process, and a group of Palestinians were the only remaining in the camp after having been rejected by all screening nation states. After a deal with the UN, Brazil and Chile took the group. They, of course, had their own interests, and we can discuss that later. But for reasons that I can express later, even years after this resettlement, several of these refugees insisted that they wanted to leave Brazil, even if that was to be returned to the Rawashed. One person also tied himself naked to the Brazilian flag in front of the National Congress, begging to be sent home, to no avail. So in sum, not all Palestinians in the world are refugees or exiles. In the Latin American case is emblematic for being shaped mainly by a pre-exile dispersion, right? And the experience of Palestinianness, of course, varies greatly according to context and subject. However, the force and appeal of the subjunctive space of Palestinianness, as I call it, we can discuss what is that later, especially when institutionally supported by political parties, social movements, and cultural and sports clubs, pushes Palestinians in the world at large to share idealized notions of Palestinianness connected to the tropes of refuge and exile that in one way or another tend to influence social belonging processes and patterns of social organization of Palestinians worldwide. And this is often done in conjunction with, not just in contradiction to, pan-Arab and or pan-Islamic sense of belonging. And so even among non-refugees, exile and longing for a return to Palestine as a moral destination is embedded in notions and feelings of Palestinianness, regardless of first-hand experiences of border crossing. So exile possesses fundamental value, not only due to its legal and political dimension, but also because it's rooted in a shared experience of Palestinianness, given its proximity to the idea of ghurba. Ghurba is the most widely used term among Palestinians, especially but not only, among refugees from the Middle East to Europe and Latin America, due to the twofold impact of this possible technical usage and its affective appeal. Elsewhere, I have developed further in my discussion of ghurba that it is an emotional complex, and it describes, for example, how often I describe how often, for example, it's mobilized in the medical context of illness, such as depression or PTSD. But here, however, I understand ghurba as an affective complex at once expressing longing, loss, and desire to reconnect to a moral destination, while emphasizing the estrangement and suffering caused by exile. And then, so I contrapose this to the Arabic term shatat, which means diaspora in Arabic. So while shatat is the staple word choice for diaspora, emphasizing human geographic distribution, ghurba points to an affective experience of exile, acknowledging the subject's own experiences and framing of this geographic dispersion. So it primarily expresses feelings and emotions related to the loss and longing for a home rejoined to a homeland. In other words, where shatat emphasizes mobility, ghurba emphasizes immobility, or the intangibility of the homeland, the unhomely, and the suffering it causes. So in Lebanon, most Palestinian refugees do not cross state boundaries, and in many cases, they have their whole existence geographically restricted to Lebanon without necessarily feeling Lebanese. In some refugee camps, such as Ain al-Halwe, they need to cross Lebanese checkpoints just to leave or enter the camp. These Palestinians, therefore, do not live cosmopolitan lives, even if they're inscribed into a foreign territory. In Europe, likewise, the situation reflects immobility at least as much as mobility. In the case of Austria and Denmark, the majority came from Lebanon, at least before the influx of refugees from the Syrian conflict after 2015. And despite taking up European citizenship, many Palestinians, particularly from Denmark, locate themselves distinct and removed from Europe, which entails a necessary reflection on transnationalism and its emphasis on the celebration of hybridism and or mobility. So yet, as opposed to diaspora, shatat, exile and forced migration, urba, directly evokes instability, insecurity, and ephemerality. Most importantly, the experience of flight and refuge is above all one of immobility. And this is so because through the lens of the concept of immobility, as our colleague who is present here, Noah Salazar, uses it, I use after him. So through the lens of this concept of immobility, based on experience and agency rather than geographic movement, not being able to move translates into immobility. And even when forced migrants traverse continents and seas and engage with various languages and embody unique cultural competencies, they cannot remain where they belong. That is, their moral but not geographic destination. So this was just a conceptual remark on how to contrapose the way COVID made us think in terms of immobility, to suggest that we stand to gain if we put this common sense understanding into perspective. So the idea here was more, was less to explore the site of my fieldwork site in relation to COVID per se, but more the experiences that I gained, and conceptually speaking, through understanding my fieldwork site even before COVID, to think about how that contraposes to a common sense idea of mobility and mobility that we're finding today as sort of dominating the world. I hope that some of this can be helpful. I'm sorry that I know that is not as tangible as the other two contributions, but maybe you can do something out of it. I hope so, at least.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. I think the papers are actually having many parallels, as I can already see. And yeah, one parallel I would say is that, as you pointed it out, COVID is least of people's worries. Probably it's a worry for us here, but not for many people where we do our research. So we would have time for a very short question here. And I see that Jeffrey has a question. And Kristín, so two very short questions, okay. Jeffrey, would you like to start?
Sure, Leonardo, thank you so much. It was really interesting. I very much enjoyed it. I very much enjoyed, and this idea of kind of producing a hegemonic immobility, because I think just to extend it maybe, so it's just a very short comment, looking at the role that the state plays in using what you're calling that kind of, I guess it's kind of like an ideological immobility that's created, you know, how the state uses that to actually then create, create and limit programs for other folks. I don't know if you want to comment on that, or I found it just a very interesting idea though.
Yeah, I mean, look, how can I comment on this right now? I mean, basically the idea of what I was trying to say, and if I can relate to what you're saying, is that a lot of us have been focusing on geographical mobility. And when you think about COVID, we always think about mobility in those terms. Oh, we cannot cross borders anymore. And so, but the fact is that a lot of people are crossing borders. They're crossing a lot of borders. But what matters to me is their experience of border crossing, which is in fact sometimes an experience of immobility, meaning that they have to cross those borders, they're pushed to cross those borders. And this was something that was given in my fieldwork experience in different fieldwork sites for the last 15 years or so, way before COVID. But what I'm suggesting here is that perhaps we have to think about the times of COVID also sort of in the same way, because people still also cross boundaries. Maybe those boundaries are not geographic boundaries of the nation states anymore as much as they used to be. But what kind of borders are we crossing now? What kinds of borders are we being pushed to cross to, in a certain sense? And not of us are being pushed to forced immobility, so to say, in the same way. I mean, I presented a project, research project on refugees and COVID-19. Based on that idea, and unfortunately the proposal was rejected, and the person said, well, you know, COVID is about to end, and so this is not something that is useful anymore. But my idea was to study exactly the effect that COVID is having on solidarities and on how people then create or relate to corporality, basically, to different social groups, how the bond is sort of different, and how they bonding to different groups, or how is this happening? So this is a kind of border crossing that is very much symbolic, but very much practical material too, in a certain way, and that we are crossing through the internet, for example. And I don't think that we're talking enough about it. So this is the kind of insight that I wanted to get to. I don't know if that sort of addresses your point or not, Jeffrey. But I didn't address the state necessarily, but
yeah.
And thank you for your comment.
Yeah, no, I think it does. And I mean, your comment here, if we want another parallel, you know, look at the way the state used HIV and Haitian immigration to the United States in the 1980s. You know, it was an ideological move to stop mobility. And the border right now, you know, the U.S.-Mexican border, certainly it's COVID's being kind of rolled out as a piece of the puzzle for limiting mobility. So it's really a great idea. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just wanted to say that I really enjoyed Biao's presentation. So I hope that we can also bring that in the frame at some point.
Thank you. Kristín had a short question, I think.
Yes, I think it is relatively short. So I'm just interested in what you started out with, you know, like Sophia said, COVID being the least of people worries. So I was just kind of curious, is this the way that you phrase it, or do the people that you are talking to, do they also make this point of reference?
Yeah.
Not seeing COVID really as so important. And,
so now,
and I thought it was kind of interesting because it also made me think about the earlier presentation by Amrita, how COVID also teases out other inequalities, you know, both kind of exaggerated them and just kind of bringing them more out in the open and providing in some sense also maybe a space to talk about them.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll definitely say just out of the bat right now that when I went to refugee camps in Lebanon right now, the situation is different than it is in the rest of the country. It is much worse because the more vulnerable population is, the more the COVID situation makes their situation worse. And so talking about forced immobility, when you talk about refugee camps and COVID-19, that becomes even stronger. The forced immobility, their forced immobility becomes even more apparent, despite the whole generalizing discourse that, well, COVID affects us all and blah, 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 which is definitely not true in my experience. Now, to Lebanon, about Lebanon, it's just that now I can bring a little bit of like concrete data for you. Just imagine yourself, you live in a country, Lebanon. Let's say you made some okay salary for the country. You made like $1,000, $1,500 per month. You could survive on that money. It's not a huge amount of money, but you could survive. You could do everything. Now, in the last 2 years, the currency itself lost 90% of the value, meaning that now you're making $100 or $150 per month. And the meal that you used to pay, say $10, now costs $3. But for you, it costs like way more than it used to cost, right? You have 2 hours of electricity per day that the state can provide. The rest has to be done privately. You have to contract, arrange the service, pay privately for a generator whenever there is gas, fuel in the country, which also does not exist. And that costs $300 a month. So if you make $150 a month, just, you know, how can you even afford that? So people cannot afford even basic things like electric energy. There are piles and piles of trash in the street. A while ago, some years ago, there was already a movement called Tala Rihatkum, like take out all your trash with you and your bad smell in Arabic, which was about the government, to take everybody out of the government, because basically the government was simply the most incompetent government ever, from all sides of the government, from the Hezbollah to the elites linked to Saudi Arabia, to the elites linked to the United States and so on. It doesn't matter. All the old political elites were seen very much as completely incapable of ruling the country. And the one thing that happened is that the total failure of any kind of public service, including trash collection. So the streets in Lebanon are again full of trash. Like you have piles of trash that are higher than me, you know, like right now at this moment, not exactly, but you had times that it was like that, and now they are really big. So we're talking about a lot of environmental hazards and like problems with public health when you don't have electricity. Say if you have diabetes, first of all, there's 90% of all the medication that used to exist in the country is also lacking. So you don't even have medication. But let's say you have diabetes and you have to take insulin. Well, first of all, there's no insulin. Secondly, even if there is, there's no electricity to refrigerate that insulin. So what are you going to do with your life? So people are dying out of the most basic causes. So people are also dying from COVID-19, but that's not something that looms high in their worries. People are dying in the streets from being shot in the head because they're from the wrong religious sect or the wrong political affiliation, and everybody, the tensions, everything, the tension is so high in the streets that a lot of things are happening in that sense, and people don't have money to bring food to their tables and to have the basic hygiene, and people are having all kinds of diseases. And so COVID is one more among everything else. And there is also the political push to take out the government and to be out in the streets and be demonstrating. But at the same time, these people who want to demonstrate, those are the people who are likely to say, well, you know, COVID is something important, so let's not be out in the street, let's do some kind of quarantine. So what do? You're caught between a hard place and the stone, as they say, you know? So it's just that it's not feasible for them to accept sort of voluntary immobility as part of what is entailed in the new normative world of COVID-19. And that sort of brings something to discuss with Biao's theory, which I definitely agree, it is something that happens, but perhaps less so in countries like Lebanon, where this kind of technocratic rule does not reach very much, or at least not with the same depth. Sorry that I took too much time already. I hope I have answered a little bit.
Yeah, but thank you for your good answers. I think we should move on with the next speaker. And yeah, so our next speaker is Dr. Geoffrey Cohen, who's from the Ohio State University, and he's presenting the paper that he was writing, I think, together with his two colleagues, as he wrote me, Andrew Mitchell and Nidia Mata Sanchez. And the working title is The Direct and Indirect Challenges of COVID-19 for Indigenous Mexican Movers. So thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation. So just it's just so nice to be a part of this, and you know, this argument that people are starting to make that COVID is somehow or another over. I'm hearing this a lot, and it's like, I don't think so. I think it's just getting started, whether it's the real or the symbolic parts of it. And that's sort of where this work actually comes from. And so I'm not going to read the whole paper. I'm just going to make some comments about it. Oh, sorry. Technology. I just apologize for that noise. I'll just make some comments about it, but I just want to say that the project that the paper comes out of is a research project that I'm doing with some colleagues in Mexico and some students of mine here at OSU, and we have had to postpone it for 2 years now, given COVID. And so part of what we were able to do was the work that we put in here. So some of this appears in a piece that was in Global Public Health, a slightly different version of this work. But what I want to do, and just sort of summarizing a little bit of what we did, is to, I think, link it to the papers that we've heard already, and potentially extend these issues of, you know, where do movers and non-movers sit vis-a-vis the state and COVID, and what kinds of challenges do they face that maybe players like the state think they're taking care of, but are not. And so what we've done is to divide COVID as a threat that has both direct and indirect challenges to indigenous communities and movers, ethnic minorities and movers anywhere kind of globally. And the direct challenges are those very specific physical impacts. I think those are the ones that get tied into that idea of this is what COVID is and this is what we have to stop. And those are not so necessarily so hard to see because we can count numbers and we can, get rates of hospitalization and so forth. The indirect impacts, I think, are far less obvious, particularly when we're working in rural and impoverished communities where communication is not necessarily very clear or very supportive of the folks there. So one of the things that we're trying to do is look at the indirect impacts of the pandemic and what they mean in terms of the pressures and stresses that have been placed on individuals and households as well as the communities in both places of origin and destination. What does it mean for that household and those individuals' well-being, and not just financial well-being, but physical and mental well-being, as well as opportunities. Okay. The second indirect effect looks at the strain on local, state, and federal support that's already typically really limited and very substandard when we're talking about the poor, ethnic minorities and indigenous folks. Okay. And then third, the assumption by the state or by federal programming, and this is a huge one, I think, and perhaps it really overwhelms the other two. The assumption by the state and federal programming, NGOs and so forth, that indigenous and poor communities lack the ability to respond effectively to the challenges that they face. And this is very clear when we kind of reduce the agency of the folks that we're talking about. So, I mean, we can look at things like indigenous poverty and understand that while the UN estimates about 5% of the world's population can be classified as indigenous, and there's a lot of debate about what that means and is that a good number. What can't really be put aside is the fact that while it's a very small portion of the population of the globe, it makes up a fairly large portion of the poor. So the UN estimates that 15% of indigenous folks globally are poor or living in poverty. In Mexico, where a lot of this work was done and where we were focused on that, 70% of the indigenous population is living in poverty, and that's probably a conservative estimate. Okay, so that's one of the challenges here. Education is a second challenge, and it really pulls the three pieces of these indirect forces together. Schooling in Mexico was already under a lot of stress and strain before the pandemic. Now, one of the most important challenges is not so much the programming or the populating of schools, it's the fact that folks that lack education themselves are being asked to support their children in virtual spaces to continue learning. And if the average achievement level is about 5th grade, helping your kids cover those gaps that they're sort of walking into with COVID becomes very, very hard. Managing instruction and resources is almost impossible. Okay, and this just is amplified in healthcare, where access is incredibly limited to begin with, and now with COVID becomes more limited. And so part of what is really important, and I think maybe this ties very nicely to what Amrita was talking about, are the kind of what I would call the comorbidities of COVID, right? The syndemics of COVID. And these are the other sorts of diseases, but they go beyond those diseases. They go into the social world that limits local communities in terms of how they might face these challenges. And so again, for the folks that we're working with, COVID is a huge challenge, but so too are COPD, hypertension, stress, obesity, and so forth. And these things are kind of pushed to the side when COVID becomes a problem. And then finally, the lack of infrastructure to support good communication becomes hugely problematic, so that you've got groups who are saying, we're doing a good job taking care of COVID. And the reality is that no one's really being taken care of. They're just not being heard from, right? So there's a lack of access to the internet. There's a lack of access to cell service. And, the government the state government in southern Mexico, in the state of Oaxaca, where I do a lot of this research, they need to be commended for putting together really nicely done, focused, engaged statements in I think 7 different native languages. The problem is there's not enough people to listen to those announcements, right? They're coming in the right languages, but the system is just not there. So our conclusions are really that that we need to look, one, at how local communities are addressing COVID, how rural, indigenous, poor, urban poor, ethnic communities are addressing COVID and responding. And in Oaxaca, where we did this research, some pretty old traditions of cooperation between families and friends are kind of being revived during the pandemic and serving to support folks. But at the same time, we have to look at how do we engage so that we can hear from these communities? How do we let the leadership of these small villages, wherever they are globally, participate in organizing a response? How do we work with those groups to get, say, clean water? It's very easy to tell people to wash their hands and wear a mask. If they have no clean water and there are no masks available, we can say it till the end of time and it's not going to make a difference. So, our point is that indigenous communities can organize and they can respond to the pandemic, and they can do it in very effective ways. However, they cannot, this doesn't resolve the threat of the infection, or it doesn't really address the roots of injustice that have already marginalized these communities even well before the pandemic hit. And so the resilience and self-reliance of an indigenous population, of the urban poor, of ethnic minorities, that's something to celebrate, but it's also not something to sort of say, that's the thing, we don't need to do this now because they're resilient. And I worry sometimes that resilience becomes this excuse for why we don't necessarily engage. So resilience can't be the goal. What needs to be the goal are efforts to harmonize and create frameworks that respond to histories of social injustice and build on these shared strengths, and at the same time recognizing what might be thought of as like the implicit biases that come with the pandemic as we meet its challenges. So I'll leave it there. There's a lot more to talk about. The papers have just been wonderful. Thanks for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to be a part of this great panel. And I look forward to hearing everyone else and any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for your paper. Yeah, we would have time for 1 or 2 short questions. So who wants to go ahead? Leonardo? Okay, please.
But again, if there's somebody else, please say, I would let them go first, no? So first of all, yeah, I mean, definitely, Jeffrey, I really liked your paper too. And I just wanted to reinforce what you're saying about the whole discourse on resilience. I mean, coming from working with refugees, I mean, you hear that a lot. And it's a total discourse that takes away from social responsibility and puts it in the people, and also among refugees it has all the other effects, as in, for example, people think that, well, the Palestinians don't suffer as much as others would because, you know, they're used to that and they're very resilient and whatever, you know. So, or poor people are like that. They're just used to poverty, or, you know, and so we have to really get away from that discourse really fast, which is really, really huge in the area of humanitarianism. So whenever you deal with refugees, that sort of thing happens, but also when you deal with other vulnerable populations. I was just going to mention that, do you know the work of Marius Singer, the medical anthropologist? Mm-hmm. And of course, so yeah, because I immediately thought about him and the idea of syndemic when you talked about the morbidities.
Comorbidity, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because it really resonates a lot with his work. For those who may not know, the idea of syndemic is just that he actually developed this whole story way before COVID, and then now he has reapplied to COVID. The idea is that there are certain conditions that it's like if you have one condition, then you have another condition. The sum of those two conditions are not exactly the same as the potential that they have as when they are together. So when you have a disease and you have like a morbid situation, for example, you have diabetes and then you have COVID-19. So that is worse than just having COVID and having diabetes separated. The conjunction of both makes it much worse. And so now the question is that Marius Singer has been using that to say that, well, if you look at who has diabetes or whoever has morbid, who is likely to have any morbid condition and be like then more affected by COVID, it's minorities, especially ethnic minorities or poor populations and so on and so forth. So the most vulnerable are way more likely to be way more affected by COVID than others. And so this is also goes really very well along with the lines that what I was trying to say in the beginning, that definitely COVID has not been affecting all of us equally, which of course is a common sense among us anthropologists, but I think it's important for us to discuss how to talk about it, how to illustrate this, and which kinds of concepts can we devise around it, and which kind of concepts are useful or not, and so on. So yeah, so
oh, absolutely, yeah.
Thumbs up.
Thank you for that. Yeah. You know, his idea of syndemics is quite inspiring for this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. Yeah, a question by Kristín also.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And I think these concepts, and Leonardo, thank you for the syndemic concept also. Can you maybe say a little bit more, Jeffrey, on the comorbidities, you know, the use of this concept and what you see, where is it coming from for the first, and how do you see it beneficial for the research that you are doing?
Yeah, thank you, Kristín. It's a really important point, and I don't think we can emphasize enough that COVID is not a single threat, right? It's not simply a virus that we have to be afraid of. It's all the other things that are accompanying it, and all the things that it sort of pushed off the screen that we're looking at. So when we're talking about really any population, one of the huge challenges is what does the virus mean we're not paying any attention to, right? And so we know, even in the US, one of the things that we know is that visiting doctors has declined dramatically, and that people are not managing, they're not managing diabetes, they're not managing hypertension, they're not getting checked for cancer at levels that's going to become super problematic moving into the future. And so these things are, this is a country with, a problematic healthcare system, but it has a healthcare system. In a country that has a healthcare system that's really under a lot of pressure and is not meeting the needs of many of its populace, that problem even becomes more extreme. And one of the things that we've seen actually with immigrant communities here in Central Ohio is at some level a kind of contest over who's going to get resources. And in at least some of the communities, one of the lines that's coming out is, we've been here longer, so we demand more. And they're framing it around, say, access to resources to combat COVID. And then you've got very rural communities here in Ohio that are native, they're not immigrant, saying, we've been here forever. You know, this is, we've been here since Ohio was a state. How come we're not getting it? And yet so it has the potential of really disrupting, right? And so that's why I think thinking about comorbidities, what are the other challenges that are facing the population? Or taking this syndemic approach where we're going to say, it's not as if like, if the threat is like a 10 if you have cancer, and a 10 if you have diabetes. It's not a 20 when you have both of them, it's a 40. So that's kind of the idea of a syndemic approach. It's to say that these different problems are not simply collectively each problem, right? They come together to create even a bigger problem. And so that's kind of what I think we're seeing a lot of that in terms of populations trying to respond to what they need around COVID. It's certainly a huge part of what's going on here in the United States. But when we frame it around indigenous, ethnic, minority, rural and impoverished communities outside of the US, I think it even gets it's amplified even more.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for your paper. I think we should move to our last speaker. We actually plan to have 6 speakers, but one speaker is missing, which gives us some 50 minutes, hopefully, for general discussion, which we also wanted to have. And the last speaker for today is Dr. Bobby Luthra Sinha, who's actually also the co-chair of the Commission for Migration. And the title of her paper is Anthropology and COVID-19, Addressing the Immobilities of the Voluntary Sector. So Bobby, I hope your connection is good enough that we can at least hear you, if not see you. And the floor is yours. I see that she's actually here with she tries on 2 accounts to get connection from a very rural place in India. So I hope, Bobby. So if her connection is not well enough, we could also move on to
I'm
the.
sending her a message on WhatsApp.
She's sending a message?
I did. I just did.
Oh, okay.
I sent her a message.
She's raising her hand, but I cannot hear her. Bobby, you're muted. I can see that you raise a hand.
May I suggest something, Sophia?
Yeah.
In the past, I had already done something like this. We got somebody on WhatsApp and put it on the camera, and the person could do, if she could, you can use WhatsApp but not Zoom.
Yeah.
If that's a possibility, we can try something like that. I don't know, just a long shot.
Yeah.
Actually, she's saying that we have to unmute her.
We have to unmute her, but I'm not.
Who is the host?
The host, I don't know. Ricardo has left, so I'm not a host.
Someone
I cannot unmute. There is no host in the room, I think, which is very. But I wonder why we have to unmute her.
I think it's kind of strange because we didn't have to unmute anyone else.
Yeah.
Bobby, if you may, just trying to hover your mouse through the upper left corner of your screen. There's going to show 3 dots are going to show up over there next to a button saying mute or unmute. Have you tried that already? You probably did, I know, but just in case you didn't, maybe that helps. That's where we unmuted ourselves.
I just asked her if she would like to talk via WhatsApp, what you suggested. Let's see if that works. Still waiting for a message. Well, otherwise, I would suggest that we continue with the general discussion. And we see if Bobby can give her paper at the very end. Also, it's kind of sad because it would be nice to have it included in the general discussion. It would fit so well. But I still don't get a message from her on WhatsApp. So I think we should go on. What do you think, Vinicius?
Yeah, I agree. And
Yeah.
maybe I don't know if you're trying on your computer, on your cell phone, Bobby, but you could try to switch maybe to your cell phone, or
she's already on the cell phone because I sent her the link with WhatsApp.
Well, we can start the discussion and Q&A, and if she managed to.
Yeah. We will still have 10 minutes at the end or something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so should I? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your presentations. I think there are a lot of interesting points we could discuss for hours here together. It's interesting to see how there are differences and resemblances between your papers. So I was more or less quiet during the presentations because I was trying to establish some connections. And well, I think that something that is very clear across all the presentations is the fact that we are scrutinizing the very meaning of mobility and immobility here, right? We are exploring the different possible understandings of mobility. What is, of course, one big part of our job as anthropologists, right? To go beyond commonsensical understandings of words and experiences. Clearly, everyone is challenging this very geographical notion of immobility. This appears in all the papers, and especially well, this was especially emphasized by Leonardo, I think, to talk about mobility beyond geography, right? This reminds me of this paper. It's a famous paper by Lisa Malki on called National Geographic, where she shows that anthropology since ever probably has this tendency to think in terms of geography. So we think in terms of genealogical trees or territories. So we have all this language, this very geographical language, and COVID helped us to, I think, to deepen this reflection on mobility and immobility beyond geography, right? We talked about capabilities, the mobility of capabilities. We talked about mobility as loitering. We talked about mobility as an experience or as a moral experience, as a morality, right? As belonging. But also we also talked about mobility in terms of geography, of course, but at different levels, articulating nations, cities, home. You know, this was very clear in Jeffrey's presentation. So I think these are some connections, general connections. I think that some papers, they dialogue in a more direct way. So, for example, what I think that either Amrita and Leonardo are talking about a moral geography of mobility. You see how in terms of how mobility is experienced and the meanings attributed to mobility by people who live, for whom mobility has very delicate meanings, right? Also, I think that Biao and Jeffrey were talking about the role of policies. So especially when Jeffrey talks about health, how people's health is neglected during COVID. So thinking in terms of health policies, and also Biao, of course, in terms of how the state manage capabilities. But on the other hand, I think that was interesting that the presentation by Amrita came after Biao, because at the same time they are very opposite to each other, right? While Biao is talking about how the state need to develop strategies and techniques to control mobilities, Amrita is talking about how, for some people, subverting this control is important for their experiences, for their lives. So, well, these are some general comments. I have one or two specific questions, especially to Biao, when he talked about immobilizing capabilities, the idea that capabilities were immobilized. I have the feeling that we could think the COVID experience as a time when capabilities were more mobilized than ever, in the sense that when we think about home office, for example, working from home, I think that this is an experience that we all here in this room can relate with, how we got kept into working and spending hours and hours a day looking at our computers at home, because our home became our workspace, right? I think that there is something that was very mobilizing in the double sense of the word. We were mobilized to work more than ever with COVID, for those who could work online from home office. And mobilizing, I mean, in many different levels. So we started to travel around the world with Zoom, right, as well. This is something I would like to reflect on. Also, we didn't talk about the mobility of goods, for example. I think this is a new frontier of anthropology, the mobility of medical goods, of vaccines, of how the COVID mobilized this kind of circulations of goods, and of course the circulation of viruses. We were talking about a disease that is circulating. So of course then we go to some reflection on non-humans, which is not really, I think, the realm of any one of us, but I think that would be interesting to think about it. That's all some comments, kick-off comments, and to give the floor to everyone. So if you would like to respond, or Biao, maybe you would like to start with my specific question.
Many thanks, Vinicius. And yeah, you know, the immobilizing capabilities probably is not a very clearly worded phrase. What I meant is that the capability of immobilizing society. So immobilizing society, as you put it so nicely, actually, it involves a huge mobilization. It's not easy at all to stop society, to stop mobility, right? In order to do that, you need huge mobilization. again, in the Chinese case, I mean, all East Asian case, that's very clear. Just to give one example, during COVID, from late January 2020 to May, all the government departments stopped working in China. So, but the civil servants have to go to work still, but they don't go to office. Where did they go? They went to all the residential communities. And it's called the sink down all the civil servants to different residential communities. What do? They visit door to door, check the temperature, and register any needs for food or for medical care, and then they liaison. So at that time, people are not allowed to go out by themselves, and everything has to be mediated through this group of officials who are deeply embedded in community. So that they need a huge amount of mobilizational work. And as you mentioned, the home office, it certainly needs a good internet connections, also all this physical infrastructure. So that's I guess is what I was thinking precisely. And we know how mobility is mobilized. We need the resources to move around, but we know less what kind of resources are needed in order to stop mobility in emergency period time. And one very telling example actually is something I didn't pay enough attention. Again, is your very good point about the circulation of goods. A very important reason in March 2020 is that day laborers in India cities had to go home is because they are day labor and they receive cash for 1 day's job. If they don't work their day, they don't have money to buy food tomorrow. So when we talk about the quarantine, you ask people stay home, a very basic precondition is that you have enough cash to buy enough food, for example, at least the last 3 days or a week. So that is a rhythm of circulation. It's related to amount of cash we have, and then the whole retail system. But we forget, I mean, at least I didn't pay enough attention to that group of population who the rhythm of a trade is very short, is everything is a daily basis. They buy food on daily basis. And that makes them very vulnerable. If anything happened, the only thing they could do was to go home. I mean, go to the countryside where they have a relative, etc. So the circulation of goods here is definitely a very meaningful angle. And then in India again, it's early this year about oxygen, this logistic issues. So this is why the notion of logistical power is very much based on recent studies on logistics. I mean, logistics is about the movement of goods, which again, has its origin in military science about war. It's all about how you move goods in the battlefield in order to ensure the soldiers have enough to eat and their guns and the cannons can be repaired on timely basis. So yeah, so I think the circulation goods are very important. And then now, of course, the circulation of information and the data. We have been talking about, the flow of information and also flow of people, capital, and information all come together. But now this is the opportunity for us to investigate systematically and empirically precisely how information flow, because now you have something called the data. It has a physical, material form actually, and also have very clear device which will capture data and transmit the data and put the data in relation to people, right? Your mobile phone and etc. So all the apps. So that is how the data now, so the information now acquire new shape, new empirical shape, of course, acquire new power relations as well. So that is, again, the circulation of the data is also very important part of the story. Yeah. No, thanks very much for these comments and the questions.
So the floor is open for.
May I just add that I really enjoyed all the papers, and I thought they really raised quite well kind of the structural and geopolitical inequalities, immobilities. And I think, Vinicius, that you were quite right in that we are exploring here is actually the what these terms mobility and immobility mean. And it's kind of interesting how much the papers, in my view, have not, I mean, they have focused on COVID, but like you were stressing, that has not been the main salient issue. And I think also the home office, I think, is an excellent metaphor for various issues relating to many of the papers, even though you were not talking necessarily about the office as such, but just being kind of confined in this space and what that means to people that are differently positioned, as Amrita presentation teased out so well. And just the many, I think the home kind of captures on very different levels many of the issues at stake, you know, like earlier people have pointed out in terms of technology, the access also to a space where you can close the door and have some privacy, you know, also even though there is a computer in the house, are there enough computers for everyone who all of a sudden had to take their studies or work online? Yeah, so I don't really have this is more of a comment than a question to anyone.
Anyone else? So yeah, Leonardo.
Please, if there's somebody else, please.
I don't think so. You can go.
Okay. No, I think it's very important what you said, Vinicius, about the circulation of goods and everything. And I actually don't see it something separated. For example, the realpolitik and the realm of morality, for example, I think they're, of course, in practice, they're very much interwoven, but I think that it's important for us to develop ways of talking about them also as they are interwoven, rather than just trying to isolate one place and the other. And in this sense, for example, one of the things that I want to highlight is, for example, that, you know, this whole discourse on COVID-19 and how it has affected everyone in the same way, that we anthropologists know that that's not true. I mean, one way of just looking at this is just looking at exactly which countries are being more affected by the economic crises that COVID has been precipitating. Right. So in the case of Lebanon, for example, of course, the case of Lebanon wasn't the crisis in Lebanon right now, which is one of the worst economic crisis in the history of humankind, basically, you know. Of course, it was not just COVID, and of course, it was not even mainly COVID, but COVID really drew it over the edge, together with a port explosion, the explosion in the port of Beirut, of course, you know. But if you go to countries like Brazil, if you go to other countries, which country can stand to maintain their economies and so on and so forth in such a crisis? Now, if you compare that to Austria here, where the government for a while had financed 70% of the income of, for example, bar owners and whatever, for them to stay at home and closed. Like, just think about the difference of this and whatever is possible in India or in Brazil or in Lebanon and so on and so forth, right? So of course this is going to emerge as in, like, let's just compare with environmentalism and so on. When you had like this Vinicius, correct me if I'm wrong, since you know a lot more about India and our Indian interlocutors here. When for example, the Indian government in the past had said, you know, all this whole discourse about how we should stop, how should we take care of the environment, at the same time that Europe and the United States already sort of established themselves as the part of the status quo, and we, the developing countries, Brazil or India or whatever, we still have to fight a lot, industrialize a lot and whatever to get there. So we're going to just destroy all the trees that we want in order to get there, because it's our right to get there. So that also shows a lot of inequality, and that is sort of like beyond the surface of what is being discussed. And even internally speaking, who, as that's something that is more commonly discussed among us anthropologists, who can afford to stay at home and who cannot. For example, can supermarket workers or whatever stay at home? Yeah, of course, those cannot. So there's some enforced mobility for those people, whereas the other ones, we can stay at home and work from home and so on and so forth. But what I'm trying to say is that there are certain dimensions of mobility and immobility that are brought about by COVID that are not being talked about as much, and they don't relate only to the practical realm or to the realm of real politics, but those things have real deep moral implications, as in the case of when somebody in India says something like that we're going to destroy all the trees and screw you, it's all right. We have to understand that there's something implicated also in the way that in this case COVID, but not only this case COVID, but also in this case COVID has deepen our the gap between the rich and poor, also globally speaking, and that has more implications to it. Then people are responding to it also in morally speaking. And so I don't know, I think that there we still have yet to create tools that allow us to deal with this in a sense. And I was hoping that perhaps we can discuss some of this now. Are there tools anybody can like maybe brainstorm some concept in anthropology that help us to relate these things? I don't know. It's just an idea of what we could discuss.
I can comment quick. Actually, this is in response to this idea. What is it that we can do? So we've been working here with there's a community here in Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio. It was settled by the UNHCR and in coordination with the second Bush administration in the early parts of the 2000s. So it's Bhutanese refugees that have been settled here. And so we've been working with the community to develop a response that is defined by them to get information into the community, particularly to people that don't have access to the internet or to cell phones and such. And so that's, we're actually using this co-produced model of development, that it's coming out of like this critique of development studies and of colonialism and of anthropology, and our the sense that, you know, we're very good at talking about what's wrong with people. We're not very good at talking to people about how we might solve some of those issues. And so it's a nice way to, I think, actually get at that question of, are there things that we can do? So we're developing a series of physical handouts that can go to the community that has like the numbers that they can call, people that they can talk to, what are the doctors that they can engage with who speak Nepali, or at least have somebody who can speak Nepali in the office. So it's that sort of stuff. I think actually there are some really neat opportunities, and that's one of the things I suppose that the pandemic is giving us the opportunity to meet them, which is interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. I think Noel wanted to comment. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your papers. I've been listening in the background. I didn't want to disturb, but it has been very interesting. And it's nice to see many of you, which I know from many different contexts, actually, who are brought here together in this virtual space. Just to comment maybe on some of the comments, many of the gaps that you seem to be pointing out in your own panel is, of course, I think, a logical outcome of the fact that this is organized by a commission and people who are mainly coming out of migration studies. So, of course, that to a certain extent colors already the interest of people and what people are working on. But just to point out that many of these things that you point out that are not being presented here are existing. I mean, there's a lot of research being done on the goods and actually all the other points you have pointed out. There's also networks. There's within Europe, there's an anthropology and mobility network with people working on mobility. I find it actually interesting how the migrations field and the people, the scholars who have been working on migration have actually picked up or not picked up this concept of mobility and immobility. And there's a very, it's a very interesting relation, and there was different reactions to it. But actually COVID has helped a lot because I think migration scholars in general, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about the wider field, are more interested in immobility than in mobility. And this has to do actually with which aspects of migration that migration scholars have looked at. And so with COVID, it's interesting how all of a sudden then, yeah, immobility becomes something that migration scholars are also picking up. But there is, of course, there is a whole field out there of scholars who have been working in a much broader context on these concepts. And so it's interesting, no matter what you are working on, if it's migration or something else, to actually also have a look at that scholarship, because it enriches actually our own thinking, and it makes us aware of the concepts and the categories that we are using and the limitations and the possibilities that these offer. Because it's very important to actually reflect on how these concepts are being used, not only by scholars, but also increasingly by policymakers. I mean, there's a whole rhetoric about mobility and immobility, and you have seen that flourish during COVID-19. So it's important that we as anthropologists also pick that up and analyze who is using those concepts, in which context, for which people, and what is behind it. I think this is very important. So this is more a general remark than anything, because I see that time is running out.
Well, thank you, Noel. I think these are extremely important questions, even for this commission. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that this is a commission on migration, and yet many of us work on very different kinds of circulation, I think, that are not necessarily restricted to migration. If we think in terms of the history of the concept and the field, I think that it's very often we go to fields of circulation, mobility, and we go back and forth. And yeah, it's impossible to think about migration strictly today, I think. So it's I think this is something to think about, for us to think about in the commission, too, how it can contribute more to the IUAES and what is being doing by IUAES members, too. I think that Sophia, sorry, that Bobby got unmuted finally. So maybe she could just say a few words about her work, and so that we can actually, well, our time, it's 1:03 already, 1 p.m. 3. So we are over time, but we can just give it 5 minutes more to Bobby talk a little, if she is unmuted finally. No, I don't think so. No, it's not working. I see that Sophia is very worried about it. Okay, well, we tried. Sophia, maybe you want to say some words to close the round table as you opened it.
Thank you, Vinicius. I'm sorry, I was just busy the last minutes to try to unmute Bobby, but even with several people together, we couldn't manage. So we are really sorry for that. But I think I have all your email addresses. I see only one person, Carla Perez. I don't have her email address. So if you would like to send it or write it into the chat, so I could just circulate Bobby's paper then to all of you. And I really enjoyed your papers, and yeah, I learned a lot, and it was really so interesting. And I hope we keep in contact and think what we can do out of this roundtable. And we would be very happy if you could join our commission meeting tomorrow. I copied the link to it into the chat, so that would be really great. And it would be really nice to continue working with you in our commission. So have a nice day, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. And thank you so much for your papers and for joining us. Goodbye from Frankfurt.